Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're going into the new gardening season and everyone's getting excited about planting. But when's the best time to apply compost to your garden beds? That's what the topic of today's video is going to be about. And this is a follow-up to a video I did back in autumn about what the best mulch is and when to apply mulch and what type of mulch to apply, and if you're going to apply compost, how to protect your compost. Do go and check that out, but wait till the end of this video and then go and check it out. But listen to what I've got to say today. So a lot of people will say that the best time to apply compost is in autumn, and that way that the worms and everything will have a chance to work that compost into the soil and the soil life will really thrive from it. So I'm of the opinion that it's better to use alternative mulches like wood chips, like straw, like leaves, and absolutely definitely use cover crops, because they protect your soil and they'll protect the compost from leaching. That's one of the things that does happen in autumn when you apply compost. The winter rains and the winter storms and the winter weather will cause the compost to lose nutrients through leaching effects, because the nutrients in compost are water soluble. So what happens is when the water washes through that compost, a lot of nutrients are lost. So you can apply compost in winter. It'll feed your soil life, great. But the thing to note is that the soil life in winter is a lot more dormant. It can't, everything slows down as the temperature drops. So those of you that do vermicompost will know that whenever the temperature drops, the worm activity and the worm life drops, slows down a lot. And sometimes it's even hard for people to keep worms alive in winter. And that's exactly what happens in the soil. A lot of the worm activity and a lot of the microbial life in the soil really slows down. So if you're applying a massive nutrients to the soil, that worm activity and that soil life and the soil food web is not going to be eating those microbes, and they're not going to bring in that into the soil as much as they would if it was slightly warmer. And that's what the focus of this video is, that we're going to talk about when and how to apply compost in spring, so it feeds your soil but it also feeds your plants, and because you've got to think about compost not just as a soil amendment. It is a great soil amendment, and don't get me wrong about that, but it's got to be used and it's got to be treated in the same consideration as a fertilizer, and I'll explain why. The use of compost as opposed to synthetic fertilizers is relatively a new movement, so the science there is not 100% developed yet, and a lot of research needs to be done as to the leaching effects and the pollutant effects of compost and the nutrients in compost. One of the biggest pollutants in our waterways is phosphorus, and now phosphorus leaches from farmers' fields and from synthetic fertilizers, but it also leaches from compost because it's water soluble. Same with nitrogen. They cause algae blooms and they cause a massive loss of aquatic life. And that's one of the things that we want to try and avoid when we're applying our fertilizers and we're applying our mulches to our gardens. There is a little bit of research into compost leaching, but the research needs to be a lot more. I'm doing an experiment at the moment, and I'll get you the results of that experiment out within the next month or so. So keep an eye out for that, and that's going to examine how compost leaches and the effects of compost leaching. So it's going to be a good one, so keep an eye out for that one. Let me go on and explain how I use compost in my garden. So this is a temporary pen that I've got on one of my garden beds, and what I do with this is I bring my chickens down here and let them tear everything up, let them eat some of the bug life, let them scratch up what they're scratching, poo on it, and they'll work the soil. And then what I'll do is I'll throw some compost in here and let the chickens work that and spread that around for me. And this is a completed bed that they've already worked on and finished off. And now with this bed, what they've already done is they've worked it, I've put compost down, they've worked that into the ground, and now that bed's perfectly ready to plant. So this is what the bed looked like before I let the chickens on it. This was really heavily sown with cover crops, but the frosts of February really killed off all my cover crops. I mean, I've not seen temperatures as low as that in the UK for a very long time. It killed all my mustard and killed all my ryegrass, and all that's left are these husks and some greens that are coming back to life. But what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to move that pen over, let the chickens on here and let them scratch this area up, and then I'll throw some compost on and let them scratch that into the ground. And then this bed's ready for me to plant into. I don't have to do any more work on it, and that's one of the great things I like about chickens. They really help. Now, I'm a big believer in cover crops, and this is some winter rye coming back to life, and I'm going to mulch that out pretty soon, and that's what I'm doing with my mustard. On one of my beds the mustard lives, so let me show you what I did with that. So that's the type of mustard that I had growing on this bed. This was covered in mustard. So what I've done with that is I've put down some sheet mulch and I'm going to lay compost on the top, and that's going to really quickly, the worms are really going to come in and work that into the ground. They'll break this cardboard down in no time at all, and they'll drag that compost into the ground. I can plant into that compost, and by the time the roots get deep enough to get to the cardboard, the worms will have already eaten it and broken it down. And this is a bed that I'm going to plant into in about 4 or 5 weeks time. So what I'm doing is I'm preparing it in advance, ready for me to start growing. I'll show you the same sort of thing that I've done on another bed, and I'll show you the effects of that. So come and have a look at that. So this bed here, I put down cardboard to stop the winter weather from eroding my garden beds. And then what I've done is, as I've harvested potatoes through winter and I've emptied out other little pots, I've been throwing the compost over the top of the bed. I'll show you now what's happening underneath. So you can see where the worms are. And these aren't just ordinary worms, these are composting worms. So you can see the original layer of mulch, and you can see the composting worms just doing their thing. If they're not earthworms, they're composting worms, so they live in the mulch layer. In a garden bed, you need a combination of both composting worms and you need a combination of earthworms, because what happens is the fertility that's generated from a composting worm is a lot more than an earthworm, and the earthworm will actually eat the poo of the composting worm. So you need a mix of both. Now, if you're applying finished compost in autumn and just expecting the worms to break that down, then all that's happening is worms are coming in, but it's the earthworms that's doing the work, and you're missing out on bringing that extra layer of life in the form of composting worms into your soil. You need them both. Now, this is the garlic that I planted back in October, and I did a video on how I plant garlic using cardboard, and it's quite a unique method. I'll lay the cardboard down and then pierce through there, and I've gone through the details of why I do that and how it works. But now that the cardboard's breaking down over winter, what I'm doing is I'm throwing on loads and loads of different bits of mulch. So anytime I'm emptying a pot, the compost is going on here, and that's going to feed the soil life, that's going to feed my plants. You've got to remember the way compost works when you apply compost to the soil. Now, the first thing that it does is it gives you an immediate release of nutrients that's going to feed plants directly. That's why I call it a fertilizer, but it's also a soil amendment, because what's going to happen is it's going to have worms coming in, you're going to have nematodes coming in, you're going to have different types of little insects and creepy crawlies that all live in here, and that's all going to bring life to your soil, and that's what you want, a soil ecosystem. So for me, to bring your garden into full life, you need a balance and a mix of everything. You need compost, you need wood chips, you need leaf matter, you need straw, you need big bits, you need small bits, you need everything that's going to break down at different rates, provide different textures, to provide different food to different things. It might have been cutting edge back in the 60s and 70s, but the science is moving on, and the developments in farming and agriculture and gardening are moving on at a rapid pace, especially now people are starting to move away from synthetic fertilizers. Think about it, try your own little experiments, do your own little mixes, see what works for you. Apply different textures to the soil, apply different materials to the soil, use different things to feed different plants. And that's what we're doing. Remember, we're feeding soil life, but we're feeding plants as well. You've got to do both. I don't think you can do one without the other. One of the ways I use compost as a fertilizer is I'll apply it direct to the planting hole. So just before I plant my plants, I'll make a small hole, apply some compost into there, and then put my plant into there and mulch the plant afterwards. So what's happening there is the roots are going to feed off the compost that's in there, and the compost that I use as a mulch, that's going to break down and slowly feed the soil. So there's different techniques you can use, and incorporating cover crops, incorporating other soil life, incorporating other things will really boost the way you garden and the fertility in your soil, rather than just applying compost to the surface. Let me show you my garden beds and the effect that applying these different mulches has had to my garden beds. This log that's forming the border of my garden bed is probably about 6 inches off the ground. Now if you look at the level of the soil inside, that's probably about 2 inches below the top, so it's about 4 inches. What I've actually done here is actually raise the level of soil in the ground by using these different mulches, by using the compost in the ways that I've described, by using wood chips, leaves, all kinds of organic matter that's lifted the soil and built my soil. What should be happening is the way you use your compost, the soil should become light and fluffy, good enough for you to be able to dig with your hands. And I'll show you. what should be happening is, as you're raising the fertility of your soil and the friability of your soil, you should be able to dig the soil with your hands. And look, that soil is lovely. And there's a nice little earthworm there, doing his little thing. That's what we want. We want to be building soil. And when I say building soil, not just building soil life and soil fertility, but the actual level of topsoil. Now, when I started on this garden, it was literally yellow clay. I mean, these beds would just flood and they'd hold water. But now you can see how friable it is. You can see how lovely the soil's become to work with. So that's how we use compost around here, and we apply it in the garden in springtime, and it feeds the soil and it feeds the plants as well. But during autumn, do look at using alternatives like cover crops and wood chips and leaves and grass and all kinds of other things, and try and experiment with them. Do go and check out my video on cover crops. It's really interesting how I use it in a no-dig bed. I'll leave it there for this one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.